Hey, hello everyone, Ben DeBono here to finish off question 23. One that, if you watched the last video, you know I'm not entirely enjoying. Not really on board with some of what Thomas Aquinas is saying here, but watch the last video for some explanation of that, and unfortunately that's going to kind of continue. But we only got four more articles to go, so for those of us who aren't crazy about some of his conclusions here, we'll get through them in a timely manner, and it won't be that big of a deal. All right. So we have Article 5, whether the foreknowledge of merits is the cause of predestination. Oops. Number 6, whether predestination is certain. Number 7, whether the number of the predestined is certain. And number 8, whether predestination can be furthered by the prayers of the saints. So, number 5. Is foreknowledge of merits the cause of predestination? And this is really an argument against Pelagianism here. So when we talk about foreknowledge in this debate, people tend to kind of go to the, Calvinist Arminianism section. That's not really what he's talking about. There's certainly a big difference between Arminianism and Pelagianism, and I think that Arminianism, when my understanding of it, when they start talking about God's foreknowledge, it's more God has foreknowledge of who would accept His grace, whereas Pelagianism, in this sense, is going to more talk about God having foreknowledge of those who, by their own merits, are going to earn salvation. And so, I guess this would be more of a semi-Pelagian position that's being refuted here. But that's kind of what's going on. All right, objections. Romans 8:29 speaks of God predestining those whom He foreknew. Predestination must be rational. The only reason to predestine would be to foreknowledge of merits. And then God is perfectly just. It would be unjust to give unequal things to equals. All people are equal regarding nature and original sin. Any inequality in them arises from their actions. Therefore, predestination must be based on foreknowledge of those actions. Okay? But Titus 3:5 says that we are saved by God's mercy, not our merits. Okay. And then we get into the article. The relationship between predestination to free will is that of first cause to second cause. No second cause can be the cause of the first cause. Merit arises out of free will. Merits arise out of free will and are therefore not the cause of predestination. So it's kind of, we've talked about that logical relationship before in previous articles. Okay. Objections answered then. God's foreknowledge is not the cause of predestination. So there is that relationship Romans 8:29 speaks of, but Aquinas is saying that doesn't imply a causal relationship. Then, as stated in the argument, this order, meaning from foreknowledge of merits to predestination, would make predestination irrational. And then things given gratuitously can be given to different degrees without injustice. So there's that. I don't find that one quite as troubling as some of the other arguments, but if I take issue with everything he says in this section, I hope we're going to be here all day. So let's move on to number 6. Is predestination certain? Well, Augustine seems to indicate that predestination can be lost. It is possible for someone predestined to sin and then to die. This would thwart that person's predestination. Then whatever God can do now, whatever God could do in the past, He can do now. Therefore, He is able to predestine and unpredestine now, just as He was able to do that in the past. But our argument from authority is going to say, back to Romans 8:29, and here, this is kind of an odd argument from authority, because Aquinas doesn't cite the verse, he cites a gloss on the verse. So I wrote that he can be interpreted to mean that predestination is certain. Predestination, then, as we get into the argument, is certain, but not in a way that imposes necessity. Predestination is therefore contingent in that free will remains in the predestined. Nevertheless, even with the presence of free will, predestination is infallible. What Aquinas is, this is where the argument kind of falls apart for me. And again, Aquinas much smarter than me. I want to acknowledge that. So I'm very possible I'm not seeing something. But this is where it falls apart for me, because it's like you can't really have it both ways. You can't say, well, free will's still there, but God is predestining, as he's going to say in a second, to the when he answers the objections, that God predestines that people use their free will in a way that results in salvation. Well, it's not free will at that point. It's pseudo free will. Um, so I think that there are some logical problems with this article, at least as far as I can grasp. And it's where his take on predestination really starts to fall apart for me. Not only in a moral sense, but also in a logical sense. So, we get into the replies to the objections. Someone predestined by God cannot lose the crown of salvation, but someone who earns the crown of salvation by merits can lose it through mortal sin. That makes me wonder, okay, so if someone who earns the crown of salvation by merits instead of predestination, can they not lose it then through mortal sin if they die in a state of grace? Is it possible to be saved outside of predestination? In other words, is it that there's two groups, the reprobate and the predestined, or is there the reprobate, the predestined, and then people who through free will can go either way? That might be reading a bit too much into St. Thomas's argument, but that would be an interpretation that I think the door is left open for here that would certainly make what he's saying more palatable. You still have the problem of some people being made reprobate, but if then you could make the argument that those are small particular cases, and that free will is open to a lot of people who are not necessarily definitively predestined and not necessarily definitively reprobate. I might be way off the reservation there, but that's an interesting thought that I think the door is open for there. All right, considering himself someone predestined could theoretically die in mortal sin. Considered from the perspective of predestination, though, this is impossible. And that's where it's not really free will. It's pseudo-free will. I already touched on that. Okay, number 3, the divine will is immutable. Therefore, it is not that God is unable to predestine, but that his will is unchangeable, which makes predestination certain. I think that's a solid argument. It's not talking it's not so much that God can't do something, but that his will is unchangeable and he is eternal. So it's not, that objection is really thinking of God in more of a temporal sense. Okay, is the number of the predestined certain? Well, Deuteronomy 1:11 speaks of God adding to the numbers of his people. No reason can be given for why God predestines a certain number. Nothing in God is without reason. Therefore, the number predestined is uncertain. And then the perfection of things would demand that if there was a set number of predestined, it would be the majority. However, this contradicts Matthew 7:13-14, which speaks of the narrow gate. But Augustine's going to say that the number of the predestined is in fact certain. Okay. The number of the predestined is certain to God by way of his deliberate choice of who to predestine. That to determine something in effect is to determine it in its parts. Therefore, predestining in effect, I didn't write that well. God knows the individuals who are predestined, and nevertheless, we must humbly accept that God alone knows that number. And there's another door that's kind of left open. How many people would be predestined? Well, if God alone knows, it's not to say that it isn't a very large number. Even everybody. I don't think Aquinas would be on board with that, and I'm not sure I would either because I'm not a universalist. Nevertheless, there's some wiggle room there as well. All right. Your objections answered. Deuteronomy refers to numbers in a temporal sense. God's knowledge of the number predestined is from eternity. It's fair enough. The reason of the number predestined is known to God, not to us. It's the same. Aquinas compares it to God's knowledge of why there are a certain number of stars. And that is a pretty fair answer as well. Number 3, the good that is common to nature is in the majority. The good that exceeds what is common to nature is in the minority, and predestination is of that second type. Okay, finally, whether which would seem to be Aquinas ruling out what we were talking about a minute ago, which would say, based on that part of the argument, I don't think you could say that everyone is predestined, because he seems to logically want to argue that it's the minority. But as we saw above, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who is saved is predestined, right? Whether predestination can be furthered by the prayers of the saints, that is our final article. And it's not quite as much of a silver lining as some of us might hope, but it's all right. Okay, predestination is eternal. While prayers are temporal, nothing eternal can be furthered by the temporal. God's knowledge is perfect and in no need of counsel. Therefore, the prayers of the saints cannot change predestination. And then if something can be helped, it can also be hindered. Predestination can't be hindered, therefore it can't be helped. Argument from authority, though. Scripture speaks of predestination being changed on account of prayer. Predestination must be considered in two parts, the divine ordination and the effect. We saw that in the first half of this question. So you can see the last video to kind of hear me talk about that division a little bit. The ordination cannot be furthered by the prayers of the saints, the eternal part, but the effect, the carrying out of that ordination can, since God ordains the predestination be brought about by good works and prayers. So again, we're in a tricky argument here where Aquinas is saying, oh yeah, prayers, free will, they're all part of it, but not really, because it's God predestining that be how his ordination of predestination be brought about. So it's not really free will at that point. That's the problem here. You can't have it both ways. And Aquinas, to a certain extent, is trying to do that, I feel. And then, Calvin gets hold of this and really goes to town on that. But we'll leave that aside for now. Okay, that first objection's answered. That first one refers to ordination. That part is eternal. Well, the carrying out of ordination, well, there's the dinner bell again. I'll wrap this up. Is temporal. Number two, the prayers of saints help God not by counseling him, but by carrying out his work as he desires it to be carried out. And then finally, predestination is a first cause, and as such cannot be hindered by secondary causes, such by prayer, but it's because God ordains that they be fulfilled by prayer. Prayer can be a part of it. All right, so that's it for this troubling, not very fun question. I think it gets a little better from here on out. Next up is the Book of Life, which is a pretty short one, so we'll knock that out in the next video, which will be out in a day or two. Till then, I'm Ben Bono, and I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.